But you notice here that the person who put the lyrics together for the Killing Joke song has the electric grid on which they want to get all of us. So bring it down. I think you get the gist. Killing Joke, again, way ahead of things. Way ahead of things, Killing Joke. Great stuff from them. Jazz Coleman and the gang. And just to mention, if you're not familiar with the origin of the term Panopticon, that comes from Jeremy Bentham, and I was talking about Jeremy Bentham last week. He was one of the founders of the utilitarian movement. John Stuart Mill helped to try to reshape the utilitarian movement in many ways, and that is the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. Jeremy Bentham and his brother developed a prison system that they called the Panopticon. And he also created a lot of different words. He was one of these sort of guys who came up with a lot of terminology that ended up entering the English language, much like Shakespeare. But I don't think he had the heart of Shakespeare in many ways. And so they developed a prison which had a central tower with concentric circles. And when I read the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin, she is a very strong critic of Jeremy Bentham and utilitarian ends justify the means, greatest good for the greatest number, sort of consequentialist theory that has no bearing on real natural rights concepts or morality, which is interesting because when they say the greatest good, who's defining good, right? So already they're assuming some sort of qualitative ethical position, but the qualitative ethical position will be imposed by people by the state. And that is extremely dangerous. Even though these guys seem to be, most of the utilitarians were very, very pro-freedom in most cases. They didn't like the state intervening. They thought that getting the greatest good for the greatest number was mostly by getting the state out of people's hairs. Their philosophy didn't really support that sort of individual concept of individual freedom. John Stuart Mill tried to reform that idea a little bit when he wrote on liberty, and very much came out in favor of pretty much freedom for everybody regarding gambling and speech and all sorts of things. But prior to that, Jeremy Bentham didn't really elucidate it that well, and they had this idea of the Panopticon, which was a prison. So the idea of this song, the concept of this song that you're seeing here from Killing Joke, which again was done years ago now, I think it's going on like 8 years now. The idea of the Panopticon was that we are all being brought into a panopticon through the internet and through the electric grid, and they're going to try to get us all on the electric grid, which is exactly what they're trying to do. You saw that story about the EVs, more promotion for EV stuff, which, as I mentioned already, there's another MRC TV piece. I'll just go over to my bio. As I mentioned, a number of articles back, there simply is not enough of raw materials in the world to actually provide for all of their so-called renewables. Study reiterates there's not enough mineral matter on Earth to run climate cult renewables. So yeah, that's a big deal. But now I want to go into not just the idea that they're trying to get us onto some sort of electric grid and they're going to monitor us all, but the portion of it that they mentioned at the beginning of it, self-censorship, and the concept of censorship being imposed on us through corporations and through government ties to the corporations and just through government itself. So our first story about this comes thanks to the folks at the Post-Millennial. And here's the headline. I want to raise this up just a little more. Canadian pastor arrested after protesting drag queen story hour event at Calgary Library. So we move out of our news flash and into this first section on free speech and the Panopticon. On Thursday, Derek Reamer, the pastor at Mission 7 Ministries in Calgary, was charged and arrested for mischief and causing a disturbance for his protest during a drag queen story hour event at Seton Library on Saturday. Now, that's a public library. According to Rebel News, Reimer was forcibly removed by proponents of a drag queen story hour event, which was held at the Canadian Library over the weekend. Video from the event shows several men pushing Reimer out of the room and shoving him to the ground. And here is what Rebel News reported. Calgary pastor Derek Reimer was physically thrown out of an all-ages drag story hour hosted by the Calgary Public Library. He was there protesting. Sorry, it jumped down because I've got so many tabs open, evidently, and the fan is going, so it's sucking up the CPU. He was there protesting against exposing kids to drag queens. Mayor Jyoti Gondek is trying to criminalize protests against these. Fight censorship against these. FightCensorshipFines.com is where you can find more. So here we go.
Voice memo. Okay, we don't have our cameras up. We are now calling the police. Stop. We have the police coming, so it is your choice to leave or deal with the police.
Very abusive in there.
We are going
For love is love.
Hey,
that looks
guys.
like very hateful, very abusive.
Why are you disrupting the program?
Because it's wicked. It's
All right, so I'm going to stop it there because I just want to remind people from a voluntarist anarchist point of view, it doesn't matter what the topics are. What matters most about this is the fundamental precept of my neighbor's money being taken, my neighbor being treated as a chattel slave in order to fund a library. That moral breach leads to all the disagreements, whether they're really big disagreements about highly questionable and likely immoral behavior being shown to kids, or it's just about the fact that Tom Sawyer might be removed, which isn't so just, or the fact they don't have enough shelf space for my books. Whatever it is, if I'm a taxpayer and my money's going to that, it opens up the tragedy of the commons. And not everybody can have his or her preferences reflected inside the tax-funded system where their money is going to help fund this thing. So that causes all the dissent. That causes all the problems. And the way that you avoid the problems is by stopping that immoral imposition in the first place and stopping the claim that government has on my neighbor. Stop claiming that the government can take a chunk out of my neighbor and force him or her to work for a certain portion of his day to fund whatever it might be, whether it's the library or it's a school lunch or it's a park and they want a baseball field on it or somebody else wants a football field on it. Get it out of that area and you actually start to allow people to reveal their own preferences through free market exchange, and then they can keep their money. And then you can also find out what they prefer within that system if it is operating in a certain way. So, for example, in my town of Amherst, New Hampshire, they wanted to have an elderly like sports thing going for activities. Now, and they also wanted a domed sports thing for the winter. Well, there already was a domed sports facility that was 15 minutes, not even that, 10 minutes away by car in the next town over in Milford, New Hampshire, that was privately run, called Hampshire Hills. And Hampshire Hills has been around for 40, almost 50 years probably now. Has swimming pools, it's got tennis courts, it's got racquetball, it's got all sorts of cool stuff there, weights, all those things, right? Massage, all those things. I think they even have a sauna in there, right? So you don't need the government to do it. And the unfortunate thing is what is seen and what is not seen, as Frederick Bottier has said, because it gives this impression that, oh, we care so much about older people that we're going to give them an activity place. We care so much about kids to be able to enjoy the winter time and play hockey under a dome or play basketball inside there. We're going to give them these things. And if you don't support it, you're an enemy. You're evil. It's just like this. Well, we're trying to be accepting of drag queens. And of course, it's mostly women. I don't know why, but if you watch these drag queen performances where they're dragging kids to be in front of the drag queens, it's almost 99% women. I don't get it. I don't understand why they're not protecting their kids this way, in any sort of fashion. It's just bizarre to me. But regardless of my opinions about whether or not a mom should or should not be bringing his or her child into the library itself is a moral problem. And that opens the Pandora's box right there. So what we see here are further problems because this guy's freedom of speech is being constrained at a public place where he should be able to speak out. But as I said, in this public place, not everybody can speak out at the same time, right? So how do you manage it? What they try to do is they try to fudge it, like, well, you can come in some other time. You can do it that way. Well, we'll allow you equal time. And that's part of the bogus argument that the FCC uses for television and radio licensing. They took over the airways in the 1920s, and they said that, well, we have to run the airways because it's a limited spectrum. Well, as I mentioned, that argument doesn't hold, because if you go around the world at any given time, there are only a certain number of usable trees. So hypothetically, theoretically, you could use up all the usable trees for paper. Does that mean that the government should be controlling book content? There's only so much shelf space you can make, right? Does that mean that the government should affect what goes on to books or newspapers or anything like that? Of course not. So they seize the airways because they say, well, the radio spectrum is limited. When in fact, the radio spectrum was being managed just fine by private property claims, and when there was bleed over, people could handle that themselves, right? Just like private property claims for actual land property, it's the same thing for the radio spectrum. It only goes so far, right? So those are the types of things that the government used as their excuses. And then they say, well, it goes over state borders. Well, lots of things go over state borders, and that's a misinterpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause, which was, as James Madison wrote in the early 1800s, supposed to be a remedial measure if states had conflicts with each other because they were imposing tariffs on each other. It was supposed to be a remedy, a way to turn to Congress to say state-on-state conflict could be resolved within Congress, not to allow for prefatory regulations on what you can and can't do over state borders. Utterly ridiculous. Now, this is Canada. They're supposedly protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which supposedly allows for free speech. But again, how can you have free speech for everybody inside the government paradigm? It doesn't work. So the very concept that you've got rights doesn't jibe with the government that is supposedly there to protect your rights. They're incompatible, especially when the government not even takes your money to create the police and the justice system, so-called justice system, to supposedly protect your rights to private property and your rights to free speech and so on. But the government itself infringes on your rights, takes your money. But in addition to that, it has to take your money for this justice system. And it is the infringer of rights. So anyway, I thought that was valuable to bring up. Now I want to bring up this next story, which I heard about thanks to David Knight this morning on the David Knight Show. And if you get an opportunity, folks, check out, of course, Knights of the Storm and see their schedule there. You can see the David Knight Show schedule there and where he's available to stream on Rumble, Gab, Twitter, DLive, and the website itself. And, of course, if you go to the website, please hop over to Wise Wolf Gold and Silver Exchange. It's davidknight.gold. If you want to go directly, David gets a percentage if you go to davidknight.gold, or you can go to wisewolfgoldandsilver.com and check out what Tony Arterburn has. Now, talking about Tony Arterburn, want to mention, just prior to the great Don Jeffries today on Rockfin, was Tony Arterburn and Arterburn Radio Transmission, and it's so easy to get there from Knights of the Storm. And he has his audio collection right there, all the stuff that you can find from him on Podbean, and on Fridays, his broadcasts are great. And you can check out his videos as well. They're all there. And you can find Don Jeffries and his show at Rockfin, which probably is just finished up. And I'm telling you, if you get a chance to watch that, please watch it. It was phenomenal. Eric Peters, numerous times, has been a regular guest on David Knight, and he's been on with me. There's me looking okay with Chiral Mad 4, I hope. And Charlie Robinson, I got to get Charlie on. And Chris Graves, Chris, you're rocking. Thank you for the tweets. Billy Ray Valentine, Angry Tiger, and Jason Barker, who are the Knights of the Storm. And it's interesting that they're down at the bottom, so please scroll down to the bottom and make sure that you give these guys a lot of attention, because they are just so great, so thorough in their research and their knowledge bases, and their moral code is so strong. So there it is, Knights of the Storm site. But I do want to mention, I saw this story over at David Knight's show. I saw it thanks to David Knight, and then I went searching for it, because that's what I do so quickly. I'm watching David's show, and I'm like, I got to open up another tab and find this. And I mentioned that in the Rockfin chat. yeah, the Rumble chat today, or it was Rockfin. I gave I think it was like $5 or something like that. But anyway, here's the story out of Florida, because hey, everybody knows that Ron DeSantis is just completely for freedom, and so are the Republicans in Florida. Well, they might not be as bad as others, but in this case, they're not so good. Tampa, Florida. Hey, memories of the Sedition Act. They're right here. Florida Senator Jason Broder, Republican of Lake Mary, wants bloggers who write about Governor Ron DeSantis, Attorney General Ashley Moody, and other members of the Florida Executive Cabinet or Legislature to register with the state or face fines. Can you say echoes of John Adams? Broder's proposal, Senate Bill 1316, information dissemination, would require any blogger writing about government officials to register with the Florida Office of Legislative Services or the Commission on Ethics. Yeah, in the bill, Broder wrote that those who write, quote, an article, a story, or a series of stories. Well, then who defines what's an article? How many paragraphs does that have to be? Are you going to come up with a government definition of what an article is? Are we going to get that far into speech controls in Florida? A series of stories? What's a story? About the governor, the lieutenant governor, or cabinet officer, or any member of the legislature, and receives or will receive payment for doing so. So can you take donations at your Substack? Must register with state offices within 5 days after the publication of an article that mentions an elected state official. If another blog post is added to a blog, the blogger would then be required to submit monthly reports on the 10th of each month with the appropriate state office. They would not have to submit a report on months when no content is published. Isn't that nice? For blog posts that concern an elected member of the legislature or an officer of the executive branch, monthly reports must disclose the amount of compensation received for the coverage, rounded to the nearest $10 value. If compensation is paid for a series of posts or for a specific amount of time, the blogger would be required to disclose the total amount to be received. So that's very curious. Again, how does this in any way jibe with either the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment? You're supposed to reveal how much you got paid? Come to think of it, how does the Internal Revenue Services, how do any of those jibe with the Fourth Amendment? How does tax withholding jibe with the Fourth Amendment? How does it jibe with the rest of the Bill of Rights? I don't understand that. Do you? They're annual, almost daily questions that I have, but they're definitely annual when I have to pay taxes. So this is coming out of Florida, everybody, and thanks to David for bringing it up on his show. They will define what an article is, and then they will be the ones who force people to report to the governor, the lieutenant governor, a cabinet officer. They'll report to the governor if they're writing about the governor, lieutenant governor, or a cabinet officer, or any member of the legislature. Now remember, during the Sedition Act era, John Adams worked very hard to get that passed in Washington, D.C., to make it illegal to criticize the president, but it was A-okay to criticize the vice president, Thomas Jefferson, his then nemesis, right? Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolutions in response to that. And then you had the Sedition, then you had the Alien Act. So it was the Alien and the Sedition Act. And as I've mentioned, his response to the Alien Act was the fourth Kentucky Resolution, where he spelled out, again, trying to remind people that immigration is not a federal purview. It's a state purview. But this is fascinating to me. Now, curiously enough, if you look at the First Amendment does stipulate that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. But within the Florida Constitution, they have the Bill of Rights there of their own. And they stipulate that you have a right to speak freely and to be a journalist. It's too bad people didn't get it. Which reminds me, it's also too bad that Nina Jankowicz doesn't get it. Oh, yes, indeed, everybody. It's fun time for Nina Jankowicz. She has started a fundraiser so that she can sue Fox News. You remember Nina, she, of course, being the one who was in charge of the so-called Ministry of Truth. Yeah, Nina Jankowicz is now asking for money because evidently her self-published book, that first one, and then later I think she got a publisher for her second book, evidently that didn't bring her enough money, and then getting money off the backs of the taxpayers with the so-called Ministry of Truth, that wasn't sufficient either. So she's asking for money to sue, and so far, as of this time, she wants $100,000, and she's gotten $7,651. She's got a 5-minute long video. She's going to be suing Fox for defamation. This woman who was in charge of the government's Ministry of Truth in the so-called Department of Justice. This guy, Paul Rawson, whoever he is, gave her $1,000. So nearly 1/8 of that comes from one guy. I don't know what he's thinking. But maybe that's like Merrick Garland under a pseudonym or something like that. But I have gotten select cuts from this. So let's talk about this freedom of speech thing and roll along in our own video presentation with some wonderful image action from Nina.
My name is Nina Jankowicz. I'm asking for your financial support of a lawsuit I want to bring against Fox News for their malicious, reckless lies against me. A year ago today, I realized a lifelong dream and entered public service as a U.S. government official. I spent the better part of a decade working on both sides of the aisle to counter disinformation. I've published 2 books.
Yes, so maybe the second one also was self-published. And this is not to drag on self-published people. I might have to do that myself. But there's a difference, a qualitative difference between her, and especially if you look at her first book, it's a mess. It's on Amazon. It's a feminist sort of screed. But you can tell that she self-published that book. She didn't do a very good job of it.
And I've always been an advocate for free expression.
Really? She's always been an advocate for free expression? Well, let's just turn to one of my pieces for MRC TV. Again, there's that. May 4th, 2022, just as she was starting to say bye-bye, as the monkeys would say, bye-bye, 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 bye-bye. Yeah, here it is. Remember Ministry of Truth? Its head is on video praising speech police and government paying for propaganda. Now, what are we talking about here? We're talking about what could be coming, and David Knight talked about this as well. I got to pull away a little bit, just give you the heads up. The FCC, as I mentioned, when it started, it was the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission. Part of the reason why I wanted to get into what they did and their argument about the limited radio spectrum is because the FCC has a panel of members. They're going to have 2 open slots, looks like. One of them is already open. It's been open for a while. And Biden's trying to get in a hardcore lefty there. But another slot might open up, and that could be a hardcore lefty leaving. So what this looks like is they are going to try to reimpose what is known as the Fairness Doctrine, which was stopped towards the latter part of the Reagan era. Reagan specifically asked for it to be stopped by the FCC. He unfortunately did not go far enough to say abolish the FCC. But the so-called Fairness Doctrine, I made a little reference to this a little bit earlier, is again how they try to translate the tragedy of the commons that they create out of the radio spectrum, because the government claims the ownership of these things, And they told the people who were granted the licenses to be able to own radio stations, the government granted them the licenses under the condition by the FCC, which started in the late 60s, of the so-called fairness doctrine, that they would have to give equal time if an opinion, a political opinion, and it only was political. It wasn't about like, I like orange juice better than grape juice, because many things are opinions, right? But it's political. Then you have to open up the airways to the opposing view, assuming there's only one, right? Which basically makes it impossible. As I say, it's impossible to run the public place like the library if you think everybody who has a right to speak is actually going to be able to speak. And so by negating private property, by turning public the radio waves, they created the tragedy of the commons for radio speech. So the FCC said, you've got to allow all of the other opinions on there. So what did that do? It had the practical effect, under the so-called fairness doctrine, of preventing freedom of speech, because the people who ran the radio station said, okay, forget it. We're not going to allow talk and opinions on the air, even on AM, which was a great medium for that because it's really not very good for music. And we're not going to allow talk. We'll do sports. That'll be the only talk. We'll do weather, maybe some news, but even there it's sort of shading things because people could say, oh, that is opinion sneaking in. But clear opinion talk radio is not going to happen. That is when Reagan asked for the FCC to drop the fairness doctrine, and which is, again, it's an Orwellian title. It's not fair at all because the government is dictating how the radio stations are going to run, and it is claiming the ownership of the airways. And then people say, oh, they're all our airways. Like, no, they should belong to the people who spend the money to broadcast over them, just like a farmer who spends the money to get the land so he can graze sheep or raise crops. And if you haven't spent the money on it, they're not your airwaves. That's ridiculous. And of course, we all know that with cable and fiber optic cable, there's an infinite number that you can have now. There's satellites you can put up. Of course, I should mention again, with fiber optic cable, and I want to make sure I say this clearly, AT&T was given a monopoly, thanks to World War I, for telephonic lines. And then when they split up AT&T, they still gave AT&T the power to control those lines for telephones. And as fiber optic cable came in for television and high-speed digital transmissions of information over fiber optic cables, they still allowed the AT&T baby bells to own those things next to the roads. And then if any cable company wanted to deliver television cable, they had to rent from the phone companies in order to get their cables. They couldn't just run, as the term goes, parallel lines. So all this stuff is all government manipulated. And this freeze frame you've got here is the video that I presented about Nina Jankowicz. And you'll see how I go into how she very much was in favor of speech controls because she favors the so-called fairness doctrine. Once the fairness doctrine was dropped, people felt free to speak on the airways. People who owned radio stations said, you know what, I'll take a chance with this guy during this time, with this lady during this time. We'll do this, we'll do this. And that's how Rush Limbaugh became huge, because people were starving for something other than the triad of television networks that were created as the FCC got created from the FRC, and they created the FCC in the 1940s. They created the red and the blue television networks, and then one of those was split off, so then you ended up getting NBC, ABC, and CBS. That is the system under which the United States operated for decades. That's why those networks are so big, because they were given that government advantage right from the start. And, of course, there was the licensing thing. So all of this is all tied up together. She's in favor of returning to the days when the government told people that you have to provide every possible opinion, which makes it unworkable because it's the tragedy of the commons. So here is a little bit from Nina.
Yeah.
Sure, I'm happily able to jump in there. I'm going to jump in on the fairness doctrine bit. I personally would welcome its return to our country, but I also think there's a point to be made about investing in journalism as a public good in the United States.
Interesting, right there. We need to stop right there. So not only is she interested in the fairness doctrine returning, but she introduces us to what is coming up as one of our next stories. The government so-called investing in, what is that? That's propaganda.
And $1.35 per person per year on our public media. And I'm sure I don't need to tell any of the members here the service that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting provides, particularly in news deserts around the country, where the local NPR and PBS stations are some of the only local journalism that is trustworthy that exists. And I think we could stand to invest more in that dichotomy and make sure that people have somewhere to go, so there isn't a vacuum for these junk news, both from foreign and domestic sources.
Unbelievable. Now, let's see how that's metastasized, because you will see coming up a couple different pieces of information that I think are pretty big. First off, Reclaim the Net. Again, second day, going to them, doing good work. Freedom of Information Request looks into Biden administration using third-party grants to push online censorship. Oh, wait a minute. What was it that Nina Jankowicz told us? Let's just go back a little bit here, because she's so interested in free speech. This woman who headed up the Ministry of Truth.
Today, I realized a lifelong dream and entered public service as a U.S. government official. I spent the better part of a decade working on both sides of the aisle to counter disinformation.
It's got to be both sides of the aisle. In other words, you worked with censorious people from both parties. It doesn't mean that you had some fairness in any way at all. You were opposed to individuals making their own choices about what to say, what to speak, what to buy, with whom they could communicate, and how much they could communicate at what times.
I've published 2 books.
You know, I'm thinking maybe somebody should have stopped her from publishing those books. Maybe there should have been some, Ministry of Truth that could decide whether she could publish books. After all, like I said, there's a limited number of trees on the planet. So maybe her books really weren't appropriate and they should have been eliminated, right? That's her approach.
And I've always been an advocate for free expression.
As we've proven, false.
The main thesis of my work is we can't fight disinformation simply by removing content or restricting speech.
Again, false. Because if you see, what's interesting about this is she was bumped out at the Ministry of Truth early enough that they didn't actually institute the things that they were starting to propose. So she thinks she can get away with claiming that she was operationally in favor of free speech, when the entire modus operandi of that so-called Ministry of Truth, the Disinformation Governance Board, the entire modus operandi of that tied in with trying to make sure that certain types of speech were blocked on social media through the back door that we know existed, thanks to Facebook and Twitter having that back door. You saw Redacted covering that. We saw the Twitter files, and we have more coming up from Matt Taibbi in the 17th tranche of this. And all that ties into something that I've been discussing since 2016, the Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act. And you'll see how Taibbi ties it all together. And it's very interesting. He does miss one small part of this. I tweeted to him about it today. I don't know whether he even got to see my tweet. But what she's saying here is just completely deceptive, because this entity was created to shut people down and also to create a further narrative of certain groups being very dangerous. We'll continue.
On March 2nd, 2022, I began a job leading a new entity within the Department of Homeland Security called the Disinformation Governance Board. My role was to make sure different entities across DHS were coordinated to bring the latest research to bear in the department.
The latest research, because everybody's got to research the basic idea of leaving your neighbor alone to speak freely. We got to do research. We're doing the latest research on it. You got to spend millions of dollars on it, right? Yeah. And by the way, earlier today, you might have seen my tweet. I had to tweet to Grace Curley because she mentioned this on her program, and she played some of these cuts. And what I found a little bit problematic was that she mentioned that the Disinformation Board has been shut down. It hasn't been shut down. Nina Jankowicz was removed from it, and the Biden administration put former Homeland Security so-called czar Michael Chertoff, the body scan man, in charge to reform its image. But we'll continue with Nina's great claims.
Help the department ensure that its policies about its existing counter-disinformation work were grounded in American values.
So let me just ask you, let's say that they don't work through the back doors as they have worked through the back doors at Twitter and Facebook to get people removed. Let's say that that's not happening in any way whatsoever, right? Let's say all they're doing, and I'm doing this intentionally, let's go with their argument that all they're doing, the way they might phrase it, is using the government to try to get knowledge out there about what is disinformation and what is not. So all they're doing is, in their eyes, just showing people what's truthful and what's not, which we would call propaganda, right? The government has a narrative. It is deciding what is true and what is not true. Why not allow us, to use the object preposition, allow us to be the ones who decide for ourselves what is truthful? I think we've seen over the past 3 years that when the government tells us things that it claims are truthful, we probably don't want to believe them, and we want to do our own investigation. But regardless of the lessons that we've learned that evidently Nina Jankowicz either has not learned or doesn't want people to learn, let's just say it's couched in that phraseology, right? And we remove the word propaganda, and we just go with the idea of what is truthful or what is not truthful, and the government can decide, which is one of the things that the World Health Organization wants to do. They want to decide what's truthful and what's not truthful. And by the way, they also want to make sure that people can be mandated to take experimental drugs. That's part of the WHO regulatory schema changes that they want. But anyway, so let's do a thought experiment here. Is it or is it not censorship for the government, which is funded through coercive taxation and threats of violence pointed against all of us? It's not voluntary. Is it or is it not censorious for the government to claim that it has to get our money to pay for this promotion of clean speech? Oh, you're very clean, aren't you? Right? Like, John Lennon's, or was it Paul McCartney's father in Hard Day's Night? This Paul McCartney's uncle or something like that. Oh, you're not very clean. So, we can draw out the logic on this. The logic dictates that, let's say you've got $100 left in your pocket, and you have two options. One option is to fund the last little bit to get your book out, Nina. You're going to go to Amazon and self-publish your book. Make some money, get your word out, whatever it might be. Maybe it's a book in favor of government censorship. But you also have the government. And the government is requiring you to fund its check on speech, even though it might be promoting what you think is good speech. But your particular speech now cannot go out because they want your $100. So your speech is affected. Just like everything else in your life is affected, whatever it might be. It's not my place to decide where you want to spend your money. Maybe there's one person on the planet wants to spend his entire fortune putting out books. That means that his right to speak is being infringed by the government assumption that he has to pay a penny to the government. And Nina, if you didn't have enough, guess who gets first dibs on your money? The publishing company or the government? I think we know the answer. Let's continue with her grand schemes and claims.
After my position was announced, baseless claims that the board was an Orwellian ministry of truth and I was President Biden's chief censor spread, even though the board had nothing to do with arbitrating or restricting speech.
Again, false. They were already arbitrating speech because they were deciding what was truthful and not truthful. That was in the name of it, misinformation or disinformation, right? So they were arbiters. They were applying their own view. They were not interested in debate because then they wouldn't have existed. They would have allowed us to offer our opinions in book reviews and things like that. They were forcibly extracting money from people to pay for their opinions to be considered official opinions and to forcibly produce messages. So it's not just the restriction of speech, it's the forced payment into someone else's speech that is a restriction of your speech. So in every way, she has no concept in any way about what is actual freedom of speech. And as I said, they were leaning towards, and in some cases already outside of her unit, the Department of Justice and the FBI already were paying Twitter $3 million to censor speech.
I quickly started receiving violent threats as a result of this coverage.
So let's check this out again. How does government operate? Does it operate voluntarily or does it only operate through threats of violence? Do people hand over their money saying, wow, this is great, you don't have to threaten me? Or if they actually decided to keep their money, would they end up being threatened with summons, fines, and if they didn't respond to those, armed people who are licensed to kill them coming to their property?
I was weeks away from becoming a mom.
Oh, listen to that music. Oh.
Fox.
Anybody remember the people who went with flaming torches screaming in front of Tucker Carlson's place? How come she didn't speak up in favor of Tucker?
Didn't seem to mind.
Fox, she says, didn't seem to mind. Interesting. Is that the case? Well, let's go over to some more stories and check out some more news. As we see there, Freedom of Information Request looks into Biden administration using third-party grants to push online censorship. And we haven't even gotten to Matt Taibbi's reports. America First Legal, this is from Reclaim the Net, has filed a Freedom of Information Act FOIA request for records of the Department of Health and Human Services related to contracts and grants to third parties to censor COVID-19 so-called misinformation and criticism of the Biden administration's response to the pandemic. So ask a lefty, say, hey, do you think it's responsible for people to put out errant information on medical stuff? Oh, no, I don't think that's responsible at all. No, of course not, right? Oh, yeah, it could get people hurt. I see. So it could get people hurt. The people don't actually control themselves. Right? Oh, no, it could get people hurt. I see. Okay. So the government's got to, you think the government should do something about that? Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, maybe probably be a good idea. Maybe the government could work with like some third-party agencies just to, so it's not just the government to do that. And they could have like, outside fact checkers and they could, make some contracts with those guys or whatever. Yeah, that'd probably be a good idea. Oh, so you're a fascist. What? You're a fascist. Oh, no, I'm not a fascist. How dare you call me a fascist? You're not a fascist? No, I'm not. But I thought you favored the government giving grants to third parties to censor bad information. Well, no, but you don't understand. I mean, this is we're trying to protect people. Oh, okay. I see. So, continuing here, a little more information. We obtained a copy of the request for you here. They have it referenced. The HHS does not have the authority to regulate content or censor misinformation of any kind. However, it has been using grants and contracts to get third parties to do so on its behalf. Yes, indeed. What a shocker. It has awarded, just like getting phone records from Verizon now, it has awarded millions of dollars in grants to fight what it deems misinformation. For instance, last October, it awarded $1.1 million in a grant to the University of Texas to better understand patterns of misinformation in social media. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, which is under the HHS, posted a grant opportunity for, quote, developing a public health tool to predict the virality of vaccine misinformation narratives. And by the way, that is a paraphrase of essentially the same thing I discussed last night, which is something that the World Health Organization is doing, or trying to do in their new revised regulations. So there is a photocopy of some of what they were doing for their grants. You can find all of this over at Reclaim the Net. Now I want to turn to Matt Taibbi's Substack, and it's going to tie in with information that I brought up a while back, and I've been bringing up for quite a while. And again, I don't want to toot my own horn, but it's been very frustrating. So I don't even want to use that term. Anyway, I have often spoken about Portman-Murphy. Yeah, so here it is. The original sin of the anti-disinformation movement. Buried in the history of the Global Engagement Center is a kernel of misunderstanding that may have spawned a generation of false panics. So the Global Engagement Center. What is the Global Engagement Center? Matt Taibbi going through the 17th tranche of Twitter files. Here we go. I might have to open up my Edge browser again because I don't know whether I might have to bring up a couple of things that I put out via email. So if I can grab those things. A brief additional note on the Global Engagement Center, one of the subjects of an upcoming Twitter Files thread. GEC was originally formed as a response to the problem of ISIS successfully recruiting away what one source called well-off white kids from the burbs in both the U.S. and Europe. Now, there I have to show him there's a bit of a disagreement here. Because the GEC, the Global Engagement Center, actually didn't start until 2016 when as I've mentioned, the Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act was released. The Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act was proposed in March of 2016, and it was used as a way to portray Russia as being behind the DNC leaks and behind the Podesta email leaks and behind the Hillary Clinton email leaks. They started it in March, but it then became a useful tool. And it was all part of demonizing Russia because, of course, as I mentioned, they had already toppled the government of Ukraine. They were trying to isolate Russian energy exports, starting with the Syrian attempt to overthrow Syria in 2011. And it all fit together to portray Russia as the bad guy. Portman-Murphy was included in the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act. It allowed for 2 years of $150 million in spending, and that was the creation of the Global Engagement Center. And I'll show you, I'll have to go off screen, but I'll show you further information that will reveal this to you. So that's where Taibbi's got it a little bit wrong, but you'll see it sort of it fits. The reason for this that they might have given had to do with ISIS, but that wasn't it at all. He might have gotten some information that's what he thought. Now, Barack Obama's executive orders was specific in outlining this mission. Now, it's very important to understand this actually comes from 2011. So we'll go into some of that as well. But the GEC actually didn't start until 2016. It wasn't from an executive order necessarily. It came from the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, including Portman-Murphy. So I'll continue. And I'll show you the documentation of that from Chris Murphy's own website, Senator Murphy's own website. He's a hardcore lefty. But anyway, this is just a small quibble that I have with Matt Taibbi's reporting here. The government always starts hurling money in all directions when any serious social problem reaches into the suburbs. Barack Obama's executive order was specific in outlining this mission. Again, this is not quite right. Establishing GEC to counter the messaging and diminish the influence of international terrorist organization, including the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, ISIL, or Al-Qaeda and other extremists so-called abroad. At the time, information operations had a specific meaning in the intelligence and counterterrorism realms. One might, for instance, spread a rumor that a certain terrorist had an STD so that he would rush online to defend his honor just long enough to be geolocated and droned. Yeah, because that's totally constitutional. Others in the national security establishment had ultimate faith in quantitative information analysis, turning life and death matters over to algorithms that armed and fired at targets in places like Yemen or Syria once enough digital boxes were checked. Military age male used, for example, military age male used the wrong cell number too many times, spotted by satellite carrying something that could be a gun, etc. We kill people based on metadata, boasted former NSA and CIA chief Michael Hayden, and he laughed about it. The original conceit of the GEC was to gather pros from this world who'd put their heads together and come up with kinder, gentler ways of disrupting ISIS propaganda. But then he gets to the point. From the point of view of the Pentagon, which paid most of GEC's original budget, it was a no-lose play. Spending $70 to $80 million a year, that's the $75 million per year, was worth it if it meant, and I've been covering this since it passed, folks. I've been watching this since this passed in 2016, to be at a U.S. soldier or bystander in a drone strike. So then 2016 happened, and GEC's mission changed on a dime. So he's assuming that the GEC already existed. It really didn't exist. And this is the key. Obama signed the original executive order in March of 2016, but it wasn't until after Donald Trump's election that a bipartisan pair of senators, and this is also false, Ohio's Rob Portman and Connecticut's Chris Murphy, put GEC into the so it was after he was elected. That is true. That is correct, yes. But they actually put it in. No, he has it wrong. I should spell this out very, very clearly. As I mentioned, they proposed this in March of 2016 as well. They proposed their bill at the same time that Obama signed the original executive order. Okay? This bill from Rob Portman and Chris Murphy, if you look at the actual record of it, they proposed it in March of 2016 at the same time Obama put this out. It didn't pass until it was folded into the NDAA. But all summer long, that stuff about Russian propaganda and Russian meddling, they worked in tandem to help promote the boogeyman of Russia and to promote the Portman-Murphy counter. It was called it the Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act of 2016. And they put it into the 2017, then they had to do it by December of 2016, and it passed. Barack Obama signed it in late 2016, National Defense Authorization Act. And he's got it right here. Section 1287 of the bill, Global Engagement Center of the NDAA. So that right there is when the Global Engagement Center started. It was with Rob Portman and Chris Murphy's Global Engagement Center was part of it in their Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act. That's what it was. And I've been writing about it, I don't know how many times, at MRC TV. And inside the NDAA, it said that the Secretary of State shall establish within the Department of State a global engagement center that would integrate interagency efforts to track and evaluate counterfactual narratives abroad that threaten national security interests, whatever they call them, whatever they want them to be. The careful language about a center within state obscured a key truth about GEC. And this is what I've been stressing. They had offices in the Pentagon and they had offices elsewhere. Watch this. This is the most important aspect of it. This is why that graphic is so key, because it's easy to remember everything. Not that you guys need it to be easy. The careful language about a center within state obscured a key truth about GEC, which is that it's not a sub-agency of the State Department at all, but an interagency group whose original partners, I've been trying to tell people this since 2017, included the FBI, DHS, CIA, the Office of the President, and multiple DOD entities. That's why they had an office at the Pentagon, including DARPA, Special Operations Command, SOCOM, and U.S. STRATCOM. The original GEC team was probably well chosen for its original task. I highly disagree, because as I mentioned, when they passed that bill, the Portman-Murphy bill, and before it even passed, I was writing about it, trying to get people to pay attention to it. It would shower $150 million on any news dinosaur that the FBI or DARPA or the CIA or SOCOM or STRATCOM or the Office of the President or the State Department wanted to receive the money. Now, as I mentioned, the original Portman-Murphy bill was a 2-year bill, $75 million per year for 2 years, $150 million total, and then it died. Donald Trump was president at that time. He didn't bring it back. What's interesting is that was February of 2018 when it died. Curiously enough, if you notice, a lot of online and old dinosaur news agencies had to drop a lot of their employees that month. Now, I can't necessarily say that that was the reason, but I'm saying that there is a correlation there that I think is very strong. So, I'm going to take this off the screen for a second, everybody, because I'm going to go over into my records and my emails, because I was in communication with the director of MRC TV, and hopefully Edge won't crash on me here or cause a wicked drag on my CPU. I was in communication with the head of MRC TV today, and yep, here it is. I brought up, first of all, hopefully this won't crash, my Edge won't crash. I might have to bring it back. Yeah, it's going real slow, but we'll see. We'll see if I can call it up. I'm hoping. Got my fingers crossed here. Yeah, I don't know. But oh yeah, good. Okay, you can hear the beeping. So yeah, it's finally working. All right, here it is. This is from Chris Murphy's own website. This is the hardcore leftist. In fact, I showed you a picture of Chris Murphy with John McCain on stage with neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Chris Murphy, hardcore lefty. I think he might be leaving this year to go do something else. But in April of 2021, he patted himself on the back along with Rob Portman, the Republican. And as I mentioned, Rob Portman is the guy who got Trump to impose those tariffs against foreign-made dishwashers and washing machines, because Portman's from Ohio and so is Maytag, and I think it's Whirlpool, and they don't like the competition, so you've got to pay more. Here it is. Washington, U.S. Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, and U.S. Senator Rob Portman, Republican of Ohio, both members of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Wednesday, welcomed passage of their amendment to authorize another $150 million in fiscal year 2022 funding for the Global Engagement Center, GEC, in order to counter propaganda and disinformation from countries like China and Russia. You see, it's not ISIS anymore, it's China and Russia, as well as foreign non-state actors. Oh, I see. This authorization represents a $90 million increase over the amount Congress appropriated for GEC in fiscal year 2021. Really? That's interesting. That's very interesting. It was only $70 million because that was only for 1 year. So this is for 150 million. That's just beautiful. The bipartisan amendment passed as part of the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, but part of the Biden Rebuilding America Act, or whatever it was, had more funding coming in, and that's where that 70 million came in last time. Propaganda and misinformation, says Murphy, threaten the United States and our allies every single day. So we got to make sure that we can spend $150 million and give it to friendly newspapers again, and people like Nina Jankowicz, right? And it's going to be done through the Global Engagement Center. State-sponsored disinformation is a threat. So what do? We get involved by doing our own state-sponsored disinformation, because that's not a threat. You didn't see anything with that pipeline called Nord Stream. And hey, remember, masks work, and so do the jabs. And oh, by the way, you can trust our numbers on COVID-19 deaths. Wink, wink. Oh, and it's totally cool that the U.S. government paid Twitter to censor you. We'll go into a little bit more here. Murphy and Portman introduced the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which was signed into law, here it is, in 2016. The law improved the ability of the United States to counter foreign propaganda and disinformation by establishing the Global Engagement Center, which was charged with leading the U.S. government's efforts to counter foreign propaganda and disinformation. The Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act authorized the State Department to request $60 million annually, actually it was more than that in the end, for 2 years from the Department of Defense for the GEC to help counter foreign propaganda and disinformation being waged against the United States. Yes. Isn't that great? And let me see. The final bit I want to show you is a little bit of history about the Global Engagement Center. This is from their own website, from the State Department. And again, you'll see, it started in 2016. It didn't exist before that, but its roots come from 2011. Establishment of the Global Engagement Center. GEC's founding traces back to 2011 and Executive Order 13584, which established within the Department of State, who was president then? Barack Obama. Within the Department of State, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, CSCC, for the purpose of supporting agencies in government-wide public communications activities targeted against violent extremism. They can define that any way they want, inside or outside the United States. Executive Order 13721 in 2016, which is the one to which Tiabi refers, transformed the CSCC into the Global Engagement Center. And then again, just to prove my point, here it is. The final bit I want to mention to you, and then we'll go back to the graphic from Matt Taibbi. GEC's mission expanded upon enactment of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017 to include the authority to address other foreign state and non-state so-called propaganda and disinformation activities. We must fight the foreign propaganda. You can go to the YouTube channel for MRC TV and see at that time the videos that I was producing for them that were talking about this. I even did like that Russian voice. We must fight the foreign propaganda. Sorry, that sounds more like Chinese or something. Some classic Anglo guy trying to do a Chinese accent. The John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019 further refined this mission and endowed it with a mandate as reflected in GEC's mission statement. That was the additional money that came around after, between 2018 and 2019, the Portman-Murphy bill did not get funding because Trump was in office. So there you go. So I'm going to bring this down here, eliminate edge again, and then go back to Matt Taibbi's piece. They're blowing it up. These are all the organizations that are involved with countering your opinions online. And Taibbi on Twitter has a thread that goes. I'll show you his thread if I can. There he is. And he's going to have more coming up. So Taibbi, going to go straight to Twitter Files 17. New knowledge, the Global Engagement Center and state-sponsored blacklists. Now, what's interesting here, everybody, is they had a list of 400, I think they were Twitter users, listed as ISIS-related users, when in fact, they were just regular old folks. Oh, it wasn't 400, it was 40,000. I'm sorry. DFR Labs said it suspected 40,000 accounts of being, quote, paid employees or possibly volunteers of India. Oh, yeah, that's right. There were a couple different things. This is the one I was thinking of India's Bharatiya Janata Party. But the list was full of ordinary Americans, many with no connection to India and no clue about Indian politics. Says Bobby Hailstone, I have no connection to any Hindu folks, just a Reagan Republican here in Connecticut. A Hindu nationalist? I've never even been out of this country, let alone the state of New Jersey, said Lady DI816. These people are insane, said Krista Woods. Twitter agreed. One reason many of the accounts remain active. Thanks, Andy, replied Trust and Safety Chief Yoel Roth. I spot-checked a number of these accounts, and virtually all appear to be real people. So what they were doing, again, was they were focusing, this stuff doesn't matter at all, this Indian stuff. What they were doing was they were trying to find some other way that they could get conservative people blocked, to silence them. And they were doing this. This is her crowd. This is the Nina Jankowicz crowd. This is their crowd. These people. The people that I thought the left-wingers didn't like the warfare state. But it's very clear that they do. It's also very clear that large portions, as I knew when I was a kid, as a punker kid, I was a Gen X guy. I knew most of the people who were supposedly peace lovers from the peace era, the hippie era, those boomers who were ahead of me. They couldn't care less about peace, most of them. They didn't care. It was their way to try to get into power, to try to get power, to try to get social programs passed that they wanted. Because they could block and demonize people as claiming they were pro-war. And even as Nixon was paring down the Vietnam War, so-called, he got demonized. And of course, I think part of the reason that he was knocked out was because the defense people and the deep state people wanted to continue operating in Vietnam, and he was stopping it. Then, when those baby boomers got into power in the office of the presidency, like Bill Clinton, Mr. Peace and Love, they bombed Astrum plants. They bombed Serbia. They starved Iraqi children because they're not in favor of war or violence in any way. They killed over 80 people at Waco, Texas, had Lon Horiuchi shoot, FBI agents shoot an innocent woman through the head, shoot a boy, 14-year-old boy in the back at Ruby Ridge. They, under Barack Obama, a little after, but still part of the baby boomers, used the Espionage Act against more whistleblowers and journalists than all presidents combined since that unconstitutional act was passed in World War I. They invaded Afghanistan. Baby boomers. Of course, that was Mr. Bush. So clearly, it was okay to protest him. When the United States is going up against Syria, try to overthrow them, when they're overthrowing Libya, when they're handing weapons out to, Egypt, or they're handing weapons out to Saudi Arabia, wiping out innocent people in Yemen, drone striking people, that's totally fine. It depends whether or not the rest of their agenda fits your collectivist Marxist agenda. Of course, now, very clearly, we can see that most of the GOPers and the left-wingers have been working the corporate side quite well. And of course, most of the left-wingers were never pro-peace, ever. And they aren't pro-race relations at all. They're pro-suckering people, getting people hooked on the teat of government, whether they're in the military-industrial complex, the welfare warfare state, the banking welfare state, or other corporate parasitic realms like pharmaceutical giants. Or they're state politicians, and they will dangle the grapes over the state politicians, the grapes of Federal Reserve cash given to the federal government and then doled out as long as you conform and you strike down people's rights to free association and you make people shut down their businesses. The Global Engagement Center, they're all right there.